What happens when a lighthearted daytime talk show suddenly shifts into a moment of serious emotional tension? The studio lights are bright, the audience is laughing, and everything feels routine, until one exchange changes the atmosphere completely. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. The camera glided across the set of The View, capturing the familiar energy of the studio. The audience applauded as Rebel Wilson took her seat at the table, smiling warmly and greeting the hosts. Joy Behar leaned forward with her trademark sharp wit, ready to keep the conversation lively. For the first few minutes, everything seemed relaxed. Rebel spoke about her latest projects, her personal growth, and the lessons she had learned during her journey in the spotlight. The audience laughed at her playful jokes, and the hosts nodded along, enjoying the easy rhythm of the interview. Then Joy Behar tilted her head slightly, her expression turning more inquisitive. "Rebel," Joy began, "you've spoken publicly about changes in your life and career. Some people say your public image has shifted dramatically. Do you ever feel pressure to keep proving yourself to audiences?" The question hung in the air for a brief moment. Rebel's smile softened. She paused, folding her hands in front of her as she considered her response. The audience, sensing a shift in tone, quieted almost instantly. "I think pressure is part of being in the public eye," Rebel replied carefully. "But I've also learned that I can't live my life constantly trying to satisfy everyone's expectations. At some point, you have to decide who you are doing it for." Joy nodded, but pressed gently. "So when people discuss your transformation, do you feel celebrated, or do you sometimes feel reduced to a headline?" The room became noticeably still. Rebel took a breath, her expression growing more serious. "Honestly," she said, "it can feel both ways. I appreciate support from fans and people who have followed my career, but there are times when the conversation becomes less about my work and more about assumptions people make about me." The audience murmured softly. Joy's tone remained measured. "Assumptions about what?" Rebel looked directly at Joy, then briefly toward the audience before returning her gaze to the hosts. "Assumptions about what success is supposed to look like," she answered. "Assumptions about what happiness is supposed to look like. And assumptions about whether someone is worthy of attention only when they fit a certain narrative." A few audience members began to applaud. Joy leaned back slightly, clearly listening. "That's a fair point," she said. "But some viewers might argue that public figures invite that scrutiny by sharing personal journeys." Rebel nodded. "That's true. When we share parts of our lives publicly, we understand that people will respond. But there's a difference between discussing a journey and reducing someone's entire identity to one aspect of that journey." The tension in the studio was palpable now, not hostile, but emotionally charged. One of the co-hosts glanced toward the audience and then back at Rebel. "Can you explain what that feels like from your perspective?" Rebel's voice became more intimate. "It feels like people stop asking, 'What is she creating? What is she contributing? What is she passionate about?' and start asking, 'How has she changed? Does she look different? Does she fit the story we want to tell about her?'" The audience listened intently. Joy's expression softened. "So your concern is that the focus can become too narrow?" "Yes," Rebel said. "And when that happens, it can erase the complexity of who a person really is. I'm proud of my growth, but I'm also proud of my work, my creativity, my relationships, and the experiences that shaped me long before any public conversation about change." For a moment, the entire table was quiet. The camera cut to audience members nodding in agreement. Some were visibly moved by the sincerity in Rebel's voice. Joy spoke again, this time with a gentler tone. "I appreciate you explaining that. Sometimes questions on television can sound simpler than the reality behind them." Rebel smiled faintly. "I know that, and I know these conversations can be valuable when they're approached with empathy." The audience applauded again, louder this time. Joy offered a small smile. "I think many viewers will appreciate hearing that perspective directly from you." Rebel nodded. "I hope so, because at the end of the day, I think we all want to be seen as whole people, not just as stories that fit into a headline." The applause continued, filling the studio with a new kind of energy. What had begun as a routine interview now felt like a moment of honest reflection. As the cameras rolled, the hosts exchanged glances that suggested they understood the conversation had reached a more meaningful level. Rebel sat poised and composed, but the emotion behind her words was unmistakable. The segment moved toward a brief pause, but the audience remained engaged, still reacting to the exchange. And as the screen faded into the next moment, one question lingered in the air. Had this simple daytime interview just become one of the most memorable conversations of the season? The applause gradually faded, but the atmosphere in the studio did not return to its earlier lightness. A subtle shift had taken place. The audience was still smiling, but now their expressions carried curiosity and concern. The hosts exchanged quick glances, as if they understood that the conversation had moved into more personal territory. Rebel Wilson sat upright, composed, but her eyes revealed the weight of what she had just shared. Joy Behar adjusted slightly in her chair and spoke with a more measured tone. "You know," Joy began, "what you're describing is something many people probably relate to. They may not be celebrities, but they understand what it feels like to be judged based on one visible aspect of their lives." Rebel nodded slowly. "Exactly," she said. "And that's why I wanted to answer honestly. It's not just about me. It's about how quickly people can make assumptions about someone's happiness, success, or worth based on what they see from the outside." The camera cut to audience members listening intently. A few nodded in agreement, while others leaned forward in their seats. One of the co-hosts asked gently, "Was there a moment when you realized that public perception was becoming difficult to navigate?" Rebel paused before answering. "There have been several moments," she admitted. "I'd read comments or see headlines that focused on one part of my life, and I'd think, but that's not the whole story. I'm a person with goals, insecurities, relationships, and experiences that can't be summarized in a single sentence." The audience responded with a soft murmur of empathy. Joy looked thoughtful. "Do you ever feel pressure to respond to those headlines?" To correct the narrative, Rebel gave a small, knowing smile. "At first, yes. I think when you care about your work and your reputation, you naturally want people to understand you accurately. But over time, I realized that constantly chasing every misunderstanding can become exhausting. You can spend so much energy trying to control how people see you that you lose sight of how you see yourself." The room fell quiet again. "That's a powerful point," Joy said, "because a lot of people probably struggle with that on a smaller scale in their own lives." Rebel's expression softened. "I think we all do. Whether you're in the public eye or not, there's a temptation to measure yourself through other people's opinions. But I've learned that self-worth has to come from something deeper than applause or criticism." A ripple of applause moved through the audience. Joy smiled. "I can see why people connect with your honesty." Rebel laughed lightly, breaking the tension for a moment. "Well, honesty can be uncomfortable, but I think it's necessary." The audience laughed with her, and the mood became warmer. Then Joy asked another question, this time with visible care. "When conversations about your personal journey become very public, what helps you stay grounded?" Rebel took a breath. "My family, my friends, and the people who know me beyond the headlines. They remind me that I'm still the same person I've always been. Public attention can make you feel like you're living under a microscope, but your real life is built in private moments." The audience listened closely. "I also remind myself why I started working in entertainment in the first place," Rebel continued. "I love making people laugh. I love telling stories. I love creating something that brings joy to others. Those passions existed long before any public conversation about my personal life, and they're still the foundation of who I am." Joy nodded. "That's a perspective a lot of people need to hear." One of the co-hosts leaned in. "Do you think the entertainment industry is changing in the way it talks about women and body image?" Rebel considered the question carefully. "I think it is changing, but slowly. There's more awareness now about the harm of reducing people to their appearance. But there's still a tendency to treat personal transformation as the most interesting thing about a person. I'd like to see more conversations that celebrate women for their creativity, intelligence, resilience, and individuality." The audience applauded loudly. Joy smiled. "That's a message worth repeating." Rebel looked around the studio, taking in the audience. "I hope people watching at home remember that they don't need to fit someone else's idea of success to have value. Everyone's journey is different, and everyone deserves to be seen as a whole person." For a moment, the studio felt less like a television set and more like a room where a meaningful conversation was taking place. The bright lights and cameras faded into the background as the emotional honesty of the exchange took center stage. Joy's voice was softer now. "I appreciate you being willing to talk about this so openly." Rebel smiled. "I appreciate the chance to explain it. Sometimes these conversations can become oversimplified, and I think it's important to add nuance." The audience applauded again, this time with a sense of admiration. As the segment moved forward, the tension that had initially sparked the moment transformed into something more reflective. Rebel's serious response had not created a confrontation. Instead, it had opened the door to a deeper discussion about identity, public perception, and the pressure of living under constant scrutiny. The camera panned across the studio, capturing the thoughtful expressions of the hosts and audience members. It was clear that the conversation had resonated with people in the room. And as the music signaled a transition toward the next part of the interview, the lingering feeling was not one of conflict, but of understanding. The audience had witnessed a moment where a celebrity chose vulnerability over defensiveness, and the result was a conversation that felt unexpectedly real. The story, however, was far from over, because once the cameras stopped rolling, the impact of Rebel's words would begin to ripple far beyond the studio walls. As the segment resumed after the break, the energy in the studio had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. The audience was attentive, the hosts were more measured, and Rebel Wilson appeared even more composed. What had started as a typical daytime interview now carried the emotional weight of a conversation that mattered. Joy Behar leaned forward again, her tone respectful but curious. "Rebel," she said, "when you talk about wanting to be seen as a whole person, I think a lot of people understand that. But do you feel there are moments when public conversations cross a line from curiosity into judgment?" Rebel paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Yes," she answered. "I think curiosity is natural. People are interested in public figures because our work becomes part of their lives. But judgment is different. Judgment happens when someone decides they know your worth, your happiness, or your intentions without truly knowing you." The audience fell silent. "That can be painful," Rebel continued, "because it reduces a complex person to a simplified story. And once that story takes hold, it can be hard to remind people that there's much more beneath the surface." Joy nodded slowly. "I can understand that, and I appreciate you being candid about it." One of the co-hosts asked, "Has this experience changed the way you think about fame?" Rebel smiled faintly. "Definitely. Fame can be a beautiful thing because it allows you to connect with people and share your work with a wide audience. But it can also create a strange distance between who you are and who people imagine you to be. The challenge is staying grounded in your real life, while so many people are forming opinions about a version of you they only see from afar." The audience responded with soft applause. Joy looked thoughtful. "Do you ever feel misunderstood?" Rebel laughed gently, but there was sincerity in her eyes. "Of course. I think everyone does at times. But in the public eye, misunderstanding can become amplified. A single comment, headline, or photo can shape a narrative that follows you for weeks or months." She paused, then added, "That's why I try to remember that my value isn't determined by a narrative I can't fully control. My value comes from the relationships I have, the work I create, and the person I strive to be every day." The audience applauded more strongly now. Joy smiled. "That's a very grounded perspective." Rebel nodded. "It took time to develop that perspective. Early in my career, I probably cared too much about how I was being perceived. I wanted everyone to understand me correctly. But over time, I realized that complete control over public perception is impossible. What you can control is your integrity." The room grew quiet again, the kind of silence that comes when people are genuinely reflecting on what they are hearing. Joy asked softly, "Was there a moment when that realization became clear for you?" Rebel took a deep breath. "I think it became clear gradually. There were moments when I felt frustrated by the way certain stories were framed. But eventually, I understood that spending all my energy trying to correct every assumption wasn't healthy. I had to focus on living my life in a way that felt authentic, regardless of whether every person watching understood it." The audience nodded, many visibly moved by her honesty. One of the co-hosts added, "That sounds like a difficult balance to maintain." "It is," Rebel admitted, "but I think it's important. Otherwise, you risk living for approval instead of living according to your values." Joy's expression softened. "I think a lot of people at home can relate to that, even if their circumstances are very different." Rebel smiled. "I hope so, because this isn't just about celebrity culture. It's about how we all want to be understood and respected. We all want to feel that our full selves are being seen, not just the parts that are easiest to discuss." The audience applauded warmly. At that moment, the studio atmosphere felt less like a television interview and more like a thoughtful conversation among people trying to understand one another. The cameras captured the attentive faces of the hosts and audience members, all drawn into the sincerity of the exchange. Joy spoke again, her voice calm and reflective. I appreciate you bringing this level of honesty to the discussion. It adds depth to a topic that is often treated very superficially. Rebel nodded. Thank you. I think conversations about personal journeys can be meaningful when they're handled with empathy, but they become harmful when they strip away a person's complexity. The audience responded with another round of applause. Joy smiled. That's an important distinction. Rebel looked around the studio and then back toward the hosts. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had, and I'm grateful for the support of people who have followed my career. I just hope that support can include seeing artists, performers, and public figures as complete human beings. For a moment, the studio was filled with applause that felt less like a reaction to a television moment and more like a recognition of a shared truth. As the conversation moved toward its closing moments, Joy turned to Rebel with a final thoughtful question. What would you want viewers to take away from this conversation? Rebel's answer came without hesitation. I'd want them to remember that every person has a story that is more complicated than what appears on the surface, she said. And I'd want them to remember that kindness and empathy matter, especially when we're talking about people we don't truly know. The audience rose into a standing ovation. The camera swept across the studio, capturing the emotional response. Joy Behar smiled and nodded, clearly moved by the sincerity of Rebel's words. As the applause continued, the segment came to a close. But the impact of the conversation lingered in the room. What had begun as a potentially tense exchange had transformed into a meaningful discussion about identity, public perception, and the importance of seeing people as more than headlines. And outside the studio, the conversation was only beginning. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the studio still carried the emotional charge of the conversation. Audience members lingered in their seats, discussing the exchange in hushed tones. Some were smiling, others appeared thoughtful, and a few seemed visibly moved by the honesty they had just witnessed. Rebel Wilson rose from her chair and thanked the hosts with a warm smile. Joy Behar returned the gesture, her expression sincere. Thank you for sharing that perspective with us, Joy said as the segment wrapped. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain it, Rebel replied. The audience applauded once more as Rebel waved and made her way backstage. But the story was far from over. In fact, the most dramatic chapter was about to unfold beyond the walls of the studio. Within minutes, clips from the interview began circulating online. Viewers shared excerpts of Rebel's response, highlighting the moments where she spoke about being seen as a whole person and resisting the pressure to fit into public narratives. Comments poured in across social media. Rebel handled that with so much grace, one viewer wrote. She made an important point about how people are reduced to headlines, another commented. Others praised the conversation for bringing nuance to a topic often treated superficially. Entertainment websites quickly picked up the story, describing the exchange as one of the most thoughtful moments from the episode. Headlines focused on Rebel's candid remarks about identity, public perception, and the importance of empathy. Television commentators discussed the segment on evening programs, with many noting how the conversation evolved from a potentially tense question into a meaningful dialogue. One commentator observed, "What stood out was not confrontation, but clarity." Rebel Wilson articulated something many public figures experience, but do not always express so directly. Another added, "The audience reaction showed that people are hungry for more honest conversations about the pressure of being constantly observed and evaluated." Backstage, Rebel was approached by members of the production team who thanked her for her openness. According to the narrative, one producer remarked, "That was a really important conversation. You could feel the audience connecting with what you were saying." Rebel smiled modestly. "I'm glad if it resonated with people. I just wanted to explain that everyone deserves to be seen beyond the surface." Meanwhile, Joy Behar reflected on the exchange during a brief off-camera conversation with the other hosts. "I think she made a very fair point," Joy said. "Sometimes questions that seem straightforward can touch on much deeper issues than we realize." The co-hosts agreed that the segment had become one of the most memorable parts of the episode because it moved beyond entertainment and into a more universal discussion about judgment, identity, and self-worth. As the hours passed, the online conversation continued to grow. Hashtags related to the interview trended in several entertainment circles, and fans debated the broader themes raised during the exchange. Some viewers shared personal stories about feeling misunderstood or judged based on outward appearances. Others discussed the pressure of social media and the tendency to reduce people to simplified narratives. For many, Rebel's response became a reminder of the importance of empathy. One widely shared post read, "This conversation wasn't just about celebrity culture. It was about how we all deserve to be seen as complete human beings." The response also sparked discussion about the role of interviewers and media outlets in shaping public perception. Commentators emphasized the value of asking questions with sensitivity and allowing guests the space to provide nuanced answers. In the days that followed, entertainment analysts described the interview as a turning point in the episode's reception. What might have been remembered as a routine celebrity appearance had transformed into a widely discussed moment of reflection. Rebel's fans praised her composure and sincerity, while many viewers commended Behar and the hosts for allowing the conversation to develop naturally. The aftermath painted a picture of a moment that resonated far beyond the television screen. It became a topic of discussion in podcasts, online forums, and entertainment columns, with people returning to the central message of the exchange. Everyone has a story that extends beyond what is visible at first glance. For Prime Spotlight viewers, the story offered more than drama. It offered a glimpse into the emotional reality of living under public scrutiny and the courage it takes to respond with honesty instead of defensiveness. As the narrative reached its conclusion, the studio lights faded in the viewer's imagination, leaving behind the echo of Rebel's final message about kindness and understanding. And that message continued to ripple outward, reminding audiences that the most powerful moments in entertainment are often the ones that reveal something true about the human experience. What do you think about this dramatic exchange and the message Rebel Wilson shared? Do you believe public figures are too often reduced to headlines, or is scrutiny simply part of fame? Share your opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this celebrity story, don't forget to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, hit the like button, and turn on notifications for more explosive and dramatic stories from the world of entertainment.